Hello, everybody, and welcome to this screencast that is going to cover rate of improvement and goal setting using graphing and doing some goal setting examples. So my name is Giancarlo Anselmo. I am an assistant professor of psychology at Winthrop University. I also currently work part-time for Cleveland County Schools in Shelby, North Carolina. Prior to starting full-time work at Winthrop, I worked for Cleveland County for 15 years doing lots of different tasks. Worked for a multitude of different schools serving K through 12 populations. At one time, I was in our infancy of doing MTSS and RTI. I was an RTI coordinator, and then most recently, before I left for Winthrop, I was an MTSS program coordinator. And basically, my job there was to provide a conduit between the EC or Exceptional Children's Land and regular education, and help with data analysis and setting up different tools for the system to use. And over the last 2 years, I've had the pleasure of working with NCDPI and Lynn McCore and a wonderful training team that includes Jacqueline Zins and Michael Thomas on providing content to school psychs in the state of North Carolina, getting us ready for the policy switch this summer for SLD determination. So that's a little bit about me. So what I want to do for this session is I have a few goals. It's going to be about, I'm guessing, about a half an hour in length, so just so you can plan your time. And of course, you can watch it at your leisure. First thing is I want to walk through a guidance document that I created about goal setting. Now, a lot of the examples in there is from experience coming from Cleveland County. It is by no way writ. It is just an example of how one county does goal setting, but it is based on research, and it is what I would say to be a sound practice. But again, different districts are going to do different things, but I just want people to have an understanding of how we've done it in the past and how I teach it at university as well. I also want to provide information about reading national CBM norm data. There were some norms that were put out some time ago by Hasbrook and Tyndall. They originally published a set, I want to say it was either 2013 or 14, but they've done a new data set that was published in 2017. Now I want to show this because the example I'm going to use, the couple of examples that I'm going to go through today are going to have oral reading fluency examples. And you say, well, why would you use oral reading fluency? We don't do that in my district. Well, the thing is that oral reading fluency, whether you go through Dibbles of Oregon or Acadience, previously Dibbles Next, they're free. And a lot of times people say that, well, we don't have something that, can get in between the gaps of when we're doing our current progress monitoring. Well, that's two examples of oral reading fluency probes that are free and no charge to anybody. So that's why I'm going to use that example. But I'm not going to use our local norms. I'm going to compare it to national norms so you can see what that looks like. Last, I'm going to teach you how to use a rate of improvement tool that I designed for kind of quick and dirty data analysis on rate of improvement, and then even kind of looking at, do you have a sound goal? Now, a disclaimer about this tool. I designed this for use for people in the state. I do not claim that it has any kind of perfection to it. It is not necessarily, something that you may want to use, but it is something that I designed so that people would have a way to kind of look at a linear trajectory or rate of improvement. So again, it's not perfect probably, and there may be a few ghosts in the machine for anybody who's worked in Sheets or Excel before. There's always little anomalies, but it's right now in a pretty good state. And so if you have nothing, I hope that you are able to find it useful for you. And then basically at the end, kind of put it all together to answer some questions about a student and how they've responded to intensive intervention. So basically we'll go through In teaching the graph, I'll kind of show you each little portion of it, and then we'll see it with some student data, and we'll be able to analyze kind of what the response has been, and then what it'll show you at the beginning as well, which is kind of nice. Finally, the materials that I'm going to go through today, including this PowerPoint, if you scan this QR code, you'll have access to everything. It'll be the norms and the PowerPoint and a link to a graph that you can use. Again, the graph initially is going to be view only with Google Sheets. You need to make sure that you create a copy for yourself, and then you can manipulate it any way you want. What you might find is that looking at the sheet, you might think, gee, it'd be nice if it did this. Well, there's a lot of smart people who are running around in your districts probably who have a lot of experience with spreadsheets. So anyways, so I would encourage you to reach out to them as well, see what they can help, and see if they can give you the functionality that you need. So the goal setting document is this. This is one of the things that'll be in the folder as well. It's just a couple of pages, and it kind of goes through the process. I'm going to go through this process within the screencast today. So anyways, so if you're, it's a separate reference basically for you, but it'll be in that folder. But we'll go through each segment of it as part of this presentation. These are the national norms that Hasbrouck and Tyndall had put together if you hadn't seen these norms before, but they're laid out really nice. I'll go over an overview of how the layout is, but norms have been set up like this for some time. I think the first group to do it was Ames Webb to set up their norms like this, where you would have, so here's grade level 1, here's the percentiles, and then this is, we don't do oral reading fluency typically in the fall for first grade, but then you come over to here, and this tells you the score that fell at each percentile time. So the way we would read this is the score at the 50th percentile, score closest to the mean, is 29 in the middle of the year. Score at the 25th percentile, kind of the end of the average range, would be 16. And then a score below the 10th percentile, or at the 10th percentile rather, would be a 9. And then of course in the spring it kind of jumps over. So that's kind of how you read one of these charts. You can see a very similar chart for STAR assessments, oral reading fluency, Ames Webb, those types of things. All right, and then this is the rate of improvement graph that we'll be looking at today. Of course, when we get there, I'm actually going to go in and manipulate it within Google Sheets. And that's an important thing that you need to understand. This was designed to be used as a Google Sheet document. So if you download it and you make it an Excel sheet, much of the functionality will go away. So again, it has to be used as a Google Sheet. All right, so kind of jumping into the content and that goal setting sheet that I said I was going to go over, the first part of it is basically talking about the best way to set academic goals for students. And most of this I'm going to talk about, in terms of when we're looking at a child who might be moving towards an evaluation in an evaluation, but this is one little difference or caveat there. So what we see here is that one of the ways that you can set goals in a school is that you could set a student's goal based on benchmarks as the goals. So this process is generally really easy, and most, if not all, systems that have some kind of benchmarking and progress monitoring will have benchmark goals that go along with it. For instance, like iStation, Dibbles, Acadians, all of these have benchmark goals that tell you basically if a student is at risk, or if they're at no risk, or if they're at some risk. And each of them kind of call that something different. Now the thing to understand though with benchmark, benchmark is where you're supposed to be, but they're all based on predictive validity. So basically meaning that, so if a child is coming out that they're not at risk at a particular time, let's do an example here. Let's say, so we have a first grader, and in the middle of the year, they're reading 23 words correct or more. That suggests they're in really good shape to meet the next benchmark, and they're on track educationally. may or may not be aligned with a certain percentile goal. So that's kind of an overview of benchmarks. And then again, so just to say it, this is an example of what the DIBELS Next or Acadience Now kind of charts look like for their benchmark goals. So another way you could do it is using percentile scores. Percentile scores, basically, you would want to use. It makes sense when you're working towards, national or local percentile score. For instance, you're going to set your goal for the 25th percentile, or you're going to set it for the 40th percentile. This makes sense when a child is basically significantly behind, and obtaining a benchmark score in a short period of time would just not be realistic for where a child needs to be and how much growth would be expected. And then, of course, too, those of you who practice in places where you have a lot of students who are struggling, you know from practice that a lot of students are going to fall below benchmarks depending on the area that you work in. So especially when we're using, these sets of data as part of the evaluation process, we want to show that a child is significantly different, okay, and significantly different from peers, not necessarily a benchmark score. Now, the benchmark score is suggesting, where a child should be granted, but if we're going to, say that a child is significantly below somebody, we really should be talking in terms of percentiles, just like we would with any of our other testing. So hence trying to move, to the statistical average range and showing growth trends, these goals might suggest a student who is responding to an intervention even though they have not obtained established benchmarks. So meaning you might have a child who starts off way below the 10th percentile, and setting a goal to the benchmark might be unrealistic. And we'll be able to talk later on about how you would be able to tell if something's unrealistic. But this is an example of first grade here, and the way the norms are set up again. So the mean score for a child, or the 50th percentile rather, to be more precise, in the winter is reading 29 words correct per minute and 60. So if you have a child who's reading less than 9, trying to catch them up to a benchmark might be unrealistic. But if we're able to look at, and understand at the end of the year, the end of the statistical average range is 34, that might be a more realistic goal. And then sometimes, when you're looking at percentiles, they do line up with benchmarks. That's just kind of how it works out sometimes. And that's kind of a win-win for everybody when that happens. So what method should I use? This is the general guidance that we use in Cleveland County, is that, when we're talking about lower tiers, when we're talking about tier 1, tier 2, benchmark goals are an easy way for teachers to set goals, and they make the most sense at a lower tier. This is, something we really do want students at benchmark, and we should be striving for that at this level. So that is, basically what we tell people. And then, when we move a child to tier 3 and we're writing IEP goals, for instance, and again, in Cleveland County, just to make sure you understand, tier 3 does not mean that they have an IEP. I'm just saying that I wouldn't in Cleveland County want to see goals written necessarily for a benchmark, nor would I want to see tier 3 goals written for a benchmark per se. So they might make more sense to understand percentiles and the rate of improvements that kind of move around that. So again, and I kind of already talked about this a little bit, but for instance, understanding that if a student is below the 10th percentile, that's a marker for being, pretty much an extreme risk, and not only being significantly below average, being significantly different from a group of students, or at least the students who are performing within the average range. So again, this document goes into, rate of improvement and goal setting. There's lots of different ways that you can set goals. I'm going to talk about basically one way, and I like to call it working backwards, where basically you understand where you want to be at some period. A lot of times at the beginning of the year, or even in the middle of the year, we might work backwards in Cleveland County from, let's say the end of the year. So this is what that would kind of look like in a stepwise fashion. First thing, and always first thing, is you need to establish a baseline on the skill you plan to measure. Good old starting point. From there, you want to choose your long-term goal. Could be a percentile score, could be a benchmark score. The one I'm going to talk about mostly today is looking at the 25th percentile for the end of the year. Again, some might say that's a really low benchmark or a really low threshold. I would agree. But for a student who's starting off so low, if we can get them over time to be functioning within the 25th percentile, we're feeling pretty good about that student, not only growth-wise, but also showing that they're not significantly different from the rest of the students anymore. Now, that's not the only data that we're taking into consideration, of course, when we're looking at a potential student qualifying for a specific learning disability. And I'll talk about that at the very end. There's lots of different things that we need to be looking at as far as rate is concerned, but this is one of them that we're going to talk about mostly today. Step 3, basically, so now we have a goal, and then we have our baseline. So we're going to subtract the baseline score from the long-term goal. That's basically, our growth. That's how much we want the student to grow over the course of however long we are going to be working with them. So step 4, we're going to divide the number in step 3 by the number of instructional weeks you have in the year. So from step 3, we understand how much we want the student to grow. Now we need to find out how much growth needs to happen each of those instructional weeks as we're working. And by dividing there, that's what's going to give us that number. So and that basically gives you the rate of improvement that you need to meet each week based on that long-term goal. So the nifty thing about this is that that number can then be used to establish your short-term goals throughout the year. So for instance, if your intervention cycle, let's just say that you do 10-week intervention cycles, then you can multiply your rate of improvement by 10 and then add your baseline score. And this equals where you would want to be after 10 weeks of intervention. And again, I'm going to show an example of this in a second, but that's basic structure of what you'd want to do. The neat thing is, in the graph I'm going to show you, is that basically it does this process for you if you understand where you want to be heading to at the end. But it's always good to understand where those numbers are coming from and what that data means. So again, this is what the procedure would be. It'd be the rate of improvement times times 10 weeks plus your baseline. That's going to be equal your 10-week short-term goal. So if you're meeting that, or you're on target for meeting that, then you know that the child is on target for meeting whatever that end goal is at the end of the year, middle of the year, however you kind of set it up. So here's an example with reading fluency for a 3rd grade student. So let's take Peter, for instance. Peter's long-term goal will be 91 words correct by the end of the year. That's the national 25th percentile score based on those norms that I showed you earlier and the norms that are in the folder that I gave to you. So setting beginning of the year short-term goals, let's go through that process. So we have our baseline. No, actually we don't have the baseline yet. I haven't given that to you. But we're going to determine the rate of improvement needed to obtain this goal at the end of the year. So here's our baseline. In September, Peter is reading 35 words correct per minute. This is way low for a beginning of the year 3rd grade student. So the 25th percentile for oral reading fluency at the end of the year is 91 words correct per minute. All right, so now we know where we're at and we know what the end goal is. All right, so, and we have roughly 30 weeks of instruction left in the year. So obviously this probably would have been somebody who carried over maybe with a plan from the previous year, just based on how timing goes and all that kind of structure. But, so with roughly 30 weeks of instruction left in the year, we would do this calculation to figure out the rate of improvement that is needed. And that would be 91, which is our long-term goal, minus 35, the baseline, is equal to 56. And we said previously that we have 30 weeks of instruction. So what we would do is we would divide 56 by 30, and that's going to give us the rate of improvement needed each week, each instructional week, in order to meet that goal at the end. And what that equals is a growth of 1.8 words correct per week. Doesn't sound too unmanageable. So let's see how we could change that then to a 10-week goal cycle. So to set the goal for an intervention cycle, take the established growth rate. Established growth rate here is 1.8 words correct per week, and multiply it by the number of weeks of intervention. So again, we're going to just say 10 weeks. You might do 8 weeks, you might do 12, you might do 14. But for us, in our example, we're going to do 10 weeks. So we want the child to grow 1.8 times 10, 10 weeks. That's going to equal 18. And then what we're going to do is we're going to add 18 to the baseline score of 35. So the final short-term goal for the graph will be 53 words correct per minute. So a goal statement might be written like this. In 10 weeks, Peter will increase his oral reading fluency from 35 words correct per minute on a third grade Dwarf probe, to 53 words correct per minute. So that's kind of a way that you can like shake things down and get to the point where you can write some meaningful goals. So then the next thing you have to kind of grapple with, though, is that, so is the growth rate too extreme? Is this something that is, because we want goals to be ambitious. We need goals to be ambitious for students to be able to catch up. However, they also need to be realistic. And this is kind of a metric we use that I kind of wanted to go through to answer that question. So the question to ask is, is the growth rate to obtain the 25th percentile more than double the local or national growth rate? So that's kind of a nice little metric to look at. So if you're going through and, if the answer is yes, if what you have figured out is going to be more than double, what we do is we end up setting the goal then at double the typical growth rate. We typically don't go above double. A lot of research that's out there and things would suggest that that might not be a realistic rate of improvement for a lot of areas, especially when you have students who are older and growth rates or typical growth rates are significantly lower at the point where they are. If the answer is no, then you can use the growth rate needed to obtain that 25th percentile score that we just walked through. So for instance, with our example that we just did, so based on the previous example, the national growth rate for a third grader from the beginning to the middle of the year is roughly 1.4 words correct per week. So roughly 1.4 words correct per week. So let's compare that to what we came up with. So our growth rate of 1.8 words correct per week falls into the category of ambitious because it is above what typical growth, but it's not unrealistic because in order to get to the point or the threshold of being unrealistic, we would be looking at something around 2.8 to 3 because that would be doubling what the typical rate is. Now, some of you intrepid psychologists out there or others watching might be, well, how did you get that growth rate? Because I've looked at the Hasselbrook and Tyndall stuff and the growth rates aren't on there. The growth rate is an extrapolation based on the data that they give us. And this is what I mean by that. So step one, so this is a third grader, okay? So step one is we're going to subtract the beginning of the year 50th percentile from the middle of the year 50th percentile, okay? And then we're going to divide that answer from step one by 10 weeks. Notice I have an asterisk there for 10 weeks because then the next follow-up question for good scientific people is, well, how do you know it was 10 weeks? The answer is, I don't. It is a guesstimate. 10 weeks is basically the best guess of how long it was between benchmark assessments. Considering they most likely did not take they did not do this testing in the first probably a couple to 3 weeks of school, and they probably didn't do it at the very last day of school either. So again, this growth rate is not the technical growth rate, I guess, but it is a good guesstimate. Typically when you look at how many instructional weeks are between benchmark periods in the schools. We've been doing this process in Cleveland County like this for about a decade, and our norms and growth rates always are in pretty good alignment with what's going on nationally. So this is a fairly good metric to be able to compare against. And again, you can see the numbers here, and then you could figure it out for the winter through the spring. Again, following the same procedure. So you'd subtract 97 from 112, whatever your answer was for that, which would be, well, let's do that real quick. 3 and 12, that is the subtraction problem right here, is going to be 15 words. 15 words times 10 weeks is about 1.5. So growth is about 1.5 there from the middle of the year to the end of the year. Again, not an exact science on the rate of improvement, but it tends to work out for our purposes. Oh, and then here's the calculation as well. So step 1, 97 minus 83 is equal to 14. Step 2, we're going to divide that 14 by 10, and we end up with 1.4 new words correct per week. All right, so now what we're going to do is we're going to turn it over, and I'm going to start showing you a graphing tool that I've designed that will be able to help you out with some of these calculations. It'll do much of what we've covered so far. But it's always good, like I said earlier, to have an understanding of where these numbers are coming from. Now, before I get into the graph, because I'm actually going to show you real data from a student, although names have been changed to protect the innocent. So the example we're going to do is Joe E., first grade student who has retained the previous school year. We don't have a lot of retentions anymore in Cleveland County, as it's been one of the nice unintended consequences of having an instructional model for placement, because typically what would happen is in the past they might do an odd comparison, but now, and what teachers and administrators started to find out was if they retained a student, they often wanted to compare them to the next year's norms because that was the year they were supposed to be in. But we as the psychologists and other people, who understood the numbers had to explain to them was that, listen, if you feel that the child needs to be, back in grade, then you need to compare them to the students that they are in school with. So a lot of times what this would do is it could potentially delay looking at a child for, exceptional children's services, because in comparison to the peers and the grade that they were in, students were doing really well. So anyways, but this was an odd one that we'd go ahead and look at. So students' data suggests, because you might too, we're going to be looking at oral reading fluency, and somebody might say, wow, so young looking at oral reading fluency. But basically the child had come along with other prerequisite skills, and the teacher had suggested that the child, based on data and based on her own observations, was commensurate with peers in those domains, things like phonics, phonemic awareness, and alphabetic principle skills. Students' middle of the year screening using Dibble's Next Acadian's probes suggested that he was behind in oral reading fluency. Specifically, his accuracy was flagged as a significant problem. There's a lot of good research coming out too about accuracy and how that is a really good flag for learning disabilities, dyslexia, whatever you want to call it. Student was receiving intervention, reading mastery 4 days a week for 40 minutes with a reading specialist in this case. In the middle of the year, this intervention was supplemented with more reading practice with connected text to increase overall fluency rates. So now I'm going to jump over and I'm going to take you through and I'm going to teach you how to use this graphing tool. Okay, what I'm going to do is take you through this rate of improvement graph, And what you'll notice first is that the first tab is directions. So you can basically use this first tab as, if you forget something or to kind of learn about what a box is. When you jump over to the progress monitoring, the PM data, this is everything that you kind of need. Now, I will direct your attention to this box over here. This is not normally here. I put this here so that you can see where I get some things from the National Oral Reading Fluency norms, because there's a couple of things that we need to fill in. So first off, you can fill in your demographic data. So you have your student name. We have Joe here. He's in the first grade. His teacher is Miss Baskin. The year, and then what skill, and then the data you're using to measure that skill. And then also jump the gun a little bit there, and the goal. But we'll talk about that in a second. So the way this would start is you'd come over to these boxes on the left side here, and there's 3 days that you could report baseline data for. Now the thing with this graph is that if you had baseline data over 3 different days, you would include it. If you had data from all the same day, just put it in one box. And if you only have 1 day of baseline data, you have to put it in this row 4 here. You can't put it in any of these 2 areas because the graph just doesn't like it. Things will not work right. So if we have one data point like we do here, 1/15/19, we put the date here, and then we put the baseline, what that score was here. Now, this goal column, it'll make sense more in a second, but what that does is it pulls over the median of these 3 data points so that basically this is going to draw our aim line for us, okay? And that's after we decide on an appropriate goal. Now, so just for orientation, let's look at these boxes over here. Everything that's in gray or darker gray line, this projected weeks to goal, present level, rate of improvement needed to reach goal, and discrepancy analysis, you don't have to do anything with those boxes. You will need to fill in some information in the 2 white boxes, okay? So far, we have the baseline data that you're going to input here, and then we have a couple of things that we need to input here, and then the demographic data to include the goal and the date to obtain goal. Now, so these columns here would be where we would start to enter progress monitoring data. Again, here we would have the date that the progress monitoring data was done, and then the data score right here. This only works with numbers, so you wouldn't want to be putting in anything beyond numbers. Okay, so again, these columns over here are going to be where we are going to be placing our progress monitoring data. And these columns over here are actually a good place to start. This is one of the things you really need to pay attention to with this particular graph. What you need to know is how many weeks you are going to run an intervention for, and that is going to set up where we're going to put basically an end date along with a goal, and I'm going to show you how to do that. So for this particular young man, Joe, he had an intervention that ran, or our original kind of, it was a little bit more than 10 weeks. We actually went a few more than that. It was actually at 14 weeks. So what we want to do is we want to count down 14 weeks each, because we're going to hope to monitor once a week. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. So in the next here, we're going to put our end date. And then, okay, so instead of putting anything in the data here, this is the only time we're going to put anything in a gray column, and that's our end goal. Our end goal for Joe was to reach the 25th percentile by the end of the year. Now, if you've been paying attention, if you look over here in this grid again, which is first grade or reading fluency norms, we see here's the 25th percentile, and there is the score at the end of the year. So we were shooting for 34. So we can go ahead and input that. And then what should happen on the graph is your aim line should get drawn. There's our aim line based on our goal. Okay. And we have our goal here, and what we want to do is we want to duplicate that date here, and what that's going to allow us is to figure out what the rate of improvement is that is needed to obtain that goal. So a lot of the things that I was showing you in the other part of the presentation kind of automatically get done here. So that date is 5/20/2000, not 2018, 2019. So we go ahead and put it in there, and then this column gets populated. And that means that the rate of improvement needed to reach the goal is 1.23 words correct per week. Okay, so what we can then do is we can check that to see if that is a crazy, unrealistic goal using that process that I went over in the other part of the presentation. So what we're going to do is we're going to look towards the 50th percentile here, and we are going to subtract the 29 from the 60, and that gives us 31 if my math is correct. And if we divide that by 10 weeks, because again here we're going to assume 10 weeks, that gives us a growth rate of 3.1. Okay, so we just figured that to be a rate of improvement of 3.1 words correct per week. That's typical. And this particular young man, Joe, needs to do 1.23 to hit that end of year goal. So that 1.23 is not, it is not crazy by any means. Seems definitely doable considering what typical growth is. So the other things that we want to input here, like I said, these white boxes, we want to make sure we get some data in there as well. And that would be the typical rate of improvement, number one, which we just figured out as 3.1. Again, that's going to be the spring minus the winter divided by 10 weeks, which is giving us 3.1. And then the national mean score. So this is the one of the areas that you have a little bit of an option. You could put in the national mean score for where you are right now or for when you're going to analyze the data at the end of the intervention. I tend to lean towards with this type of graph to put in the mean score for where we're going to be at the end of the intervention, which would be in the spring. So let's go ahead and input that, and that would be 60. What that's going to do is allow us to show us just a discrepancy analysis, which takes us a little bit away from growth, but is important nonetheless. So that's the first part of this process, this setup. Just as review, we're going to have our baseline data here. If we only have one data point, we're going to make sure that we put it in this box. It will automatically carry over the starting point for our aim line. We count down how many weeks we're going to have an intervention, put the date for when we plan to meet or plan to conclude the intervention. Over here in this box, we're going to put the goal. We're going to make sure that we have that same date over here, and then also that goal as well over here. And that'll allow all of our formulas to run in the background when we have more data. And voila, just like that, we have data in the graph. I always used to like watching cooking shows where they would show how to cook it, and then they would put it in the oven, and then they would pull it straight out of the oven. I kind of equate this process to that. Anyway, so now we can kind of see how the data fell for this young man and where he ended up at our intervention. Again, just to review, and we'll go over each of the segments just so you have a good understanding of what's going on with the graph. Again, here we had our baseline. Here we were entering the dates of progress monitoring and the data or the student scores rather. And then here we had the end date and the goal, end date and the goal. And now we can run through and kind of see what the analysis was for this table here. So currently, based on the current rate of improvement, this student is projected to meet the goal in 14 more weeks. Okay, just to be thinking about it in context, this was a child who was retained in first grade and has been receiving intervention for most of his first year in first grade, and then also now for his second year. Again, I am not a proponent of retentions, something unfortunate that happened in this particular case. Present level is 25 words correct per minute. The present level will always be the median of the last 3 data points collected. So it's a lot of times people will talk about taking the last data point. It's not the best case because there is a lot of fluctuation with curriculum-based measurement data. So it's nice to look at the median to get a good idea and takes out the outliers. The rate of improvement for this child, this is how many words correct they are gaining per week. Okay, so there we see this child is gaining 0.65 and typical rate of improvement is 3.1. That is a significant difference for, thinking about it. It's almost 5 times discrepant from typical growth. I'll go into that a little bit later. Now, so then we have the national mean score. We knew the rate of improvement needed to reach goal. Note that this box, once you set up what we did previously, this will not change. This is giving you what was needed at the start of the intervention in order to reach the goal. And we see that the child is currently growing 0.65, so they did not come close to this, and that's why they have not met the goal. And of course, visual analysis, you can see that. We see our aim line, and then of course the students' trend and their data suggests that they were kind of at the aim line, and then we trailed off to a direction that is not as good. Now, this is the only piece of data here that doesn't have anything to do necessarily with rate of improvement, but it's a nice little metric to look at in that. So we see that the student's current level is 25 and the national mean score is 60. One way that you can figure out how low a student is in comparison to peers is by basically dividing that 60 by 25. And when you do that, what you find is that the student is 2.4 times discrepant from typical peers. That is a pretty good metric to suggest that the child is significantly lower. Of course, another way that you can do it too is to compare their present level of performance to the percentile score. So at 25, where does that fall? If we go over here and we look at our chart, we see that that 25 would fall in between the 10th percentile and the 25th percentile. And that is how you use this rate of improvement graph. Now let's go back and we'll look at basically some questions and some overall what we're thinking about the case. Okay, so if we were going to kind of like summarize this case, what was going on is we could basically ask some questions about what was going on. So was the student growing? Absolutely the student was growing, and most often that is the case, that there will be some growth. The question for us becomes how much. So yeah, the student was growing. However, the current growth rate was 0.65 words correct per week. So how does that growth compare to typical growth? And I kind of talked about this a little bit while we were looking at the graph. But so typical growth is 3.1 new words correct per week. If you divide typical growth by the student's growth, you'll find that that student was 4.7 times discrepant from normal growth. Even though, but the other thing to keep in mind as well, and this is where districts will have to make a decision about how much can they tolerate as far as a student being behind and how long it'll take them to catch up. This student was 15 weeks away from, obtaining the average range, but we were also getting ready to go into summer break as well. So that's something to think about as well. So how long will it take to reach the average range? It was about 14 weeks. So again, typically in Cleveland County, when we're inside of a year, we're feeling fairly confident that the student is doing well enough for responding to intervention. However, and finally, how discrepant is the student's current performance from average student performance? And again, based on the metrics that the graph calculated for us, we see that the student was 2.4 times discrepant from average student performance. So that's a lot of the data that we can take away from that one graph. But we always have to consider, what else would you need for criterion for the SLD policy? This is really important. We need to consider that other sources of information that would suggest the student is not making sufficient progress. Because we have to remember, we are not trading off one discrepancy model necessarily for another. We are, time series graphs cannot be the only type of data that we present to suggest that a child has a specific learning disability. Do I believe that they need to be part of the decision-making process? Absolutely. However, it is not sufficient for placement therein of itself. We have to use good team decision-making based on all the data that we have at our hands. So what data might you have that pertains? So other things that show progress over time is you might have other benchmark scores that you could look at and compare benchmark rates of improvement to. So a lot of districts use MAP or iReady or STAR assessments, iStation if it sticks around. Those types of things can show another metric to say that a child is either making progress or not making progress in the domains that we're looking at. Then, and then really important is, what does the data from the regular classroom suggest? Does the data suggest that, the student is actually generalizing skills over? Are they just learning these basic skills and not able to generalize? That may give us an idea of where we need to go with intervention long term, whether the child's going to qualify for an IEP or not. But that data from the classroom becomes really important, whether it's common formative assessments, benchmark assessments that are going on in the classroom. That type of stuff becomes really important and is part of the decision-making progress, in addition to the rate of improvement data that we should most definitely have. So, I appreciate you listening to this, and just kind of, a final, statement about this particular case was this student did end up qualifying for services as a student with a specific learning disability. And it was an odd case a little bit, just because some of the metrics didn't necessarily line up with how we generally, what we say are, our cutoffs, if you will, in Cleveland County. Because typically, we would have a student be, they would be taking a long time to catch up, and they would be below the 10th percentile. But this child was more than 2 times discrepant from peers, and they had had a lot of time in first grade curriculum at this point, and lots of good intervention through reading mastery that we felt really good about, and they were not progressing at a rate that was catching them up in any sort of reasonable amount of time. So this child did go on to qualify, and the student is still in special education at this time. However, he is making progress and doing a bit better, moving on to more comprehension-focused goals as opposed to just oral reading fluency. So again, thanks for listening. Here is my email address. If you have any questions for me, that have come up as you're looking for this. Again, the graph that I showed you, it's not perfect. There may be some issues, and I apologize for that. But by and large, kept in Google form and not changing any of the formulas should give you a little bit of a tool to be able to use to look at rates of improvement if you don't have anything else. Again, thank you so much, and I'll see you in a training sometime.